Thank you, Kristen. Welcome, everyone. Good morning, good afternoon, depending on where people are dialing in and videoing in from. Robert Iamazzo. I am a managing director with ZRG SIBA, where I am the global head of enterprise risk, lead our practice there, and really delighted to continue our collaboration with Professor Cliff Rossi and the University of Maryland and their business school, Robert H. Smith School of Business, where Cliff is the professor of the practice for the Risk Institute there. And welcome to our first quarterly webinar series. I know we're about 6 days in, or looking at it's about 6 days past the end of the quarter, but due to spring break schedules and holiday schedules, we had to push this out. But we're just creeping it into Q1, if you will, part of our webinar series here. And the discussion today, we were saying earlier, while planned about 2 months ago, is a bit prescient given everything going on in the market here. So welcome, and certainly would like to extend a heartfelt welcome to Mia Pittman, who is currently the Chief Risk Officer at the Federal Housing Authority based in Washington. Mia, thank you so much for joining us today, and welcome. And at this stage, I'll turn this over to Cliff so we can kick this off.
Thanks a lot, Rob. And again, welcome everybody who is attending this session. To your point, 3 lines of defense is relatively new. What I'd like to do before me and I kind of go into our Q&A, just a couple of comments and give you context on this concept of 3 lines of defense that we'll be speaking about over the next 45 minutes or so. As we go through the discussion, I'd encourage everyone that has questions to kind of put them either into the chat or Q&A. I'll be picking them up periodically. And then either during or right as we close out the last 10 minutes or so of this discussion, I'll pose them to Mia and see where we go from there. So please, as things come up, be sure to kind of put those into the Q&A. So if you go back a while to the 2008-2009 crisis, before that, we really didn't have this doctrine that we refer to as 3 lines of defense. So it's very, very new in our vernacular from a risk management standpoint. If you think about sort of the history of banking or financial services, this is rather new to the scene. And it came about largely because of some of the things that we saw happen during the last crisis. But here's the thing. Just 2 years after the Institute for Internal Audit came up with the new formalized structure of 3 lines of defense, the Bank for International Settlements said, hey, I think we have a problem here that despite the fact that many organizations, many banking institutions have actually adopted some form of 3 lines of defense, we still have a series or have experienced a series of banking scandals or risk events that when you trace it back can go back to the roots of something happening in the risk governance space, particularly around some failure or deficiency around 3 lines of defense. So with that in mind, there's been a lot of introspection about this concept. And what we'd like to do today is kind of dig into that some more. Mia clearly is well qualified to tackle a lot of those kind of issues with us. But some of the critiques that we see come around roles and responsibilities, coordination, broken processes, and just overall sort of misalignment of what these organizations, these 3 lines are doing. So with that, kind of setting the stage, and we'll dive into this in a little bit more, but what I'd like to do to level set for this audience is just give us a run through of what 3 lines of defense is and why it's important to the ERM or enterprise risk management process.
Sure. Well, good morning again, everybody. And thank you, Cliff and Rob, for having me here. Cliff, as you said, it's about a decade ago that the IIA formalized the 3 lines of defense risk management governance framework. And basically what the framework does is it provides a way for us to look at where the various risk management activities should lie within an organization, and then what the appropriate relationship amongst those parts of the organization should be. So 3LOD, as we refer to it colloquially, starts with the assumption of a governing body, right, to which all 3 lines are ultimately accountable. For most for-profit organizations, the governing body is the board of directors, right? So the board's role is to articulate that organization's approach to both strategic growth and risk management, and then vests its authority for executing both of those priorities in executive management. Executive management, in turn, has oversight of both the first and second lines. So the first line of defense is the function that's accountable for the accomplishment of whatever the business objective is. So for-profit companies, we think of this as the business line. The business line is vested with the responsibility and the authority to pursue the activities that are necessary to grow the business. But here's the thing, because they're the function that's closest to the operations, and in most cases, the client of the company, they are also the owners of the risk. And that's really, really important in a 3LOD context. They are the risk takers, right? And the risk makers, and so they own the risk. The second line, in turn, is independent risk management, and its accountability is the independent assessment, monitoring, and reporting of the risks that arise from first line activities. Let me be clear about independence in this context. When we talk about the second line, what we're really talking about is being unbeholden in any way to the first line, right? That is in contrast to the third line. The third line most of us are familiar with is internal audit, who is fully independent of executive management and is accountable only to the board of directors. So you can sort of see from my description, the concepts of independence and accountability are really, really significant in the 3LOD framework. And those concepts really are what undergird the idea of productive ERM.
So with that in mind, right, and I think we can all probably point to any number of issues that have crept up over the last several years or even beyond in terms of the blurring of roles and responsibilities between the three lines of defense. I mean, on the one hand, we talk about it in the context, as you said, about clarity in roles and responsibilities, that we have this objective, independent second line that's sitting out there that, if you will, are the standard setters for which the risk owners in the first line, you know, are receiving sort of the overall guardrails for how you frame that. But in the past, right, and you probably experienced this too, there is this tendency, or there can be this tendency of a blurring of those lines. What do you suggest or about trying to address those kinds of pitfalls so that there's better clarity in how these lines interact with each other?
Yeah, so I think that's exactly it, a lack of clarity around organizational boundaries. And I think there's a little bit of historical context that's important to note there. And I started talking about it a little bit before we got started formally. And that's really respecting the fact that our function as independent risk management is really still very, very new, right? Mm-hmm. Our function really only comes into play as a clearly defined, understood organizational entity post Enron and Sarbanes-Oxley, right? SOX is where we really get this concept that a board of directors is fundamentally responsible for understanding its internal control and risk management environment, right? Prior to that, right, and that's only 20, 21 years ago, prior to that, it was still widely acceptable for organizations to manage risk vis-a-vis audit finding, right? So there's a very long-standing acceptance and understanding of what a first line is, right? The business line, and then what a third line is, right? Internal audit. It is relatively recent that this concept of a second line, an entity that is independent of the first line, but that the nature of what it is there to monitor and report on isn't something that you should allow to go to the point of audit finding, because at that point it's too late. Right. So I think we do need to sort of put a pin in that and have an understanding around it's still relatively new. That said, and Cliff, you and I talked about this before, it's a very much a tone from the top kind of thing. You have to have the understanding and the buy-in from boards of directors, from executive management, what the value proposition, and we'll talk about that in a minute, but what the true value proposition of risk management is. I'll also say that, you know, in most situations, current scenarios may not be included in this, but this is also one of the places where regulated industries like banks may have a little bit of a advantage over non-regulated entities, because the regulatory bodies can be the best friend of the second line. The regulatory entities can weigh in. I've seen this happen actually, where regulators have said to boards, hey, you know, your third line, your second line or third line function, right, doesn't have sufficient stature, doesn't have sufficient resources. It really needs to be beefed up. It needs to be, you know, given a little bit more attention. And I've seen those things addressed. So that's another thing to consider. Again, in regulated industries, that's one of the ways that risk can be bolstered within an organization and facilitate some of that clear delineation with the first line.
Yeah, I think there's been a lot of change in that, actually. I call that the air cover that CROs need to have. I had no such air cover at WAMU, Countrywide, or Citigroup from my regulators at the time, I'll just say. So I think a lot has changed, right? Everybody got religion, you know, in the foxhole, so to speak, after 2008. Yep. So I think there's that, and we did get it. We got a question in the chat, which I think is a good one here, which is why are we still talking about 3 lines of defense after the IIA, you know, updated this all for 2020? And I guess the spin I'd have on that is that while there has been, yes, that's true, that some changes did occur and were updated around that. And I think we don't actually refer to it as 3 lines of defense. It's actually the 3 lines model or something like that. Most institutions that you know, I talk with still to this day are still leveraging some form of what I still call in my mind 3 lines of defense model. So is that your understanding as well, Mia? Or?
Yeah, I appreciate the question. The enhancement to the model was primarily one that reinforced the idea that, particularly between the first and second line, it wasn't determined to be so, it wasn't intended to be so static. In other words, the enhancements were really to reinforce the idea that we want cross partnership, we want some cross pollination between the first and second line, but we still want to reinforce the idea of independence such that the second line cannot be squashed by the first line. So the 2020 updates didn't in any way sort of scale back the idea of the importance of 3 lines. It softened the line, if you will. And I think it's a really good question.
Yeah, this is an interesting one too. I mean, beyond just kind of the interaction model between first and second, and I don't want to, you know, ignore the third line, but a lot of that the action is between the first and the second line, where we get these either healthy or unnatural tensions that occur. But we also know that the risk owners in the first line, they are facing a number of competing forces, right?
Absolutely.
From within and from outside the company. The constant drumbeat of meeting quarterly earnings, achieving that and other tangible business objectives, where, you know, they're also presented then with, you know, risks that from a probabilistic basis may or may not sort of manifest. And so I think those are kind of competing interests to folks in the first line, particularly that emphasis on focus on short-term performance, right? And so how can companies, if you think of this 3 lines model as kind of like a 3-legged stool, how can we do a better job of improving the balance between risk and return within the first line, and then also with respect to the second and the overall governing authority there?
Yeah, so I love this question because it really speaks to what is, from my perspective, the necessity of the second line's perspective in an organization. I think more than any of the other 2 lines, second line leaders have to have what I call systems thinking, right? You gotta be able to see the interconnectivity of all of the forces in the organization, and to your point, specifically the pressures that the first line is under, right? And so I think one of the things I do want to say in this conversation is that in my career, I have now occupied a space in all 3 lines. So I spent the first half of my career as an originator, second half of my career in second, third, and regulatory roles. So I do have an appreciation for the challenges of the first line, right? But I also understand the second line's value proposition is the sustainable pursuit of the organizational objective. And the underline and the italicized there is sustainable, right? So what you've got to be able to communicate to your first line partners is, I get it, right? We get it. We get what you are being charged with. We get what you are being asked to do, right? And we want you to win, but we want you to win sustainably, because if you don't win sustainably, then ultimately we all lose. Either the market's going to shut you down, the regulators are going to shut you down, possibly both, right? But we want you to win sustainably. And so it is the communication of from the second line in terms of, I understand the environment in which you exist, you are operating, and what it is that I am demanding of you, right? And so I'm going to attempt to do that in such a way that it facilitates, right, what you are already trying to accomplish, as opposed to moving against, either from a timing scheduling perspective, or just something that sort of just disrupts, right? The fact of the matter is, you are the risk owner, right? You are the risk owner. And so in owning that risk, there are some things that we expect for you to understand. We also expect for you to have a bit of objectivity, right, about your business, such that you can take a step back and say, okay, it is my goal to sustainably serve my client, right? And so in order to do that, I have to have a degree, I'm speaking from the first line now, I have to have a degree of objectivity, right, about the risk that my first line business actually does generate. And if I want to sustainably serve my client, right, then it is in my best interest to engage around the monitoring and the reporting on that risk.
Yeah, no, that's interesting. And that's extremely difficult, right? That's a very oftentimes almost like a third rail type of issue when you're having these conversations. Again, I'll go back to my own experience back in like 04, 05, and saying, look, we're going to put a mark in terms of how much we think the risk associated with a pay option arm is, and go into a board meeting when they're trying to launch a product that would be a bank only product being originated by the parent, Countrywide Financial, at a time when you're going over there and they are having none of what the second line is saying about the risk, their anticipated risk profile associated with that type of product is, and they're just basically saying enough, right? So again, depending on and again, we're going to get into this a little bit more. A lot of that comes down to risk culture, mindset, and the fact is that, and I think you would agree that everybody is a risk manager, should be a risk manager at these companies, right? Whether you're in the business line and audit or wherever you are. I mean, everybody's job is risk management. Everybody's job is to manage, to your point, I love that word, sustainability. Long-term sustainability of the franchise is key here. And I think oftentimes and it was kind of what I was getting at in that question, which is it's a balancing act, right?
Yep.
Between that risk and return. And that's why I like risk adjusted returns as a metric better than like an ROE type of a metric at times. But so as the CRO, you sit, as you said, you sit in the second line here. So what do you think are the critical activities, kind of going back to these intersection points, these face-offs, if you will, between first and second line, that have the critical activities for those second line professionals to effectively carry out their duties vis-a-vis the first line? What would you be looking for them to be doing to fulfill that responsibility?
Yeah, and I want to, in answering that question, I want to firmly acknowledge something that you just said about your experience. Where we are in the business cycle has a huge impact, right, on our ability to be effective as a second line, right? The frothier the business cycle gets, the economy gets, the harder it is for us to say what it is that we have to say, right? One of the things that we must acknowledge as second line professionals is that there is a natural organizational bias towards the first line, right? And everybody has it, The board of directors has a natural bias to the first line. Executive management has a natural bias to the first line. Everybody gets paid, including the second line, based on what the first line generates, right? So you're talking about, Cliff, I mean, talk about, yelling at windmills, right? Right. You're talking about, when the tide of money, right, is just rushing in the direction of the organization, and you and your team are the people whose jobs are to say, okay, stop, right? Stop the tide of money, right? That's a really, really, really difficult thing to do. Part of that is, you have to sort of build your credibility now, right? We talked about this a little bit when we were getting started, right? Now, when things are rocky, when there are headwinds macroeconomically that sort of do like this, right? This is sort of when risk management, when people are sort of scratching their heads, this is when risk management gets a little bit more attention. And so you kind of, you need to take these opportunities to sort of put your stake in the ground. In terms of the types of ways that I expect for risk leaders to be operating to be most effective, there's a few traits that I think are extremely key for risk management leaders. So first of all, courage, right? We just got finished talking about, what that takes to be the team in the room saying the thing that nobody wants to hear, right, at the time when they need to say it. And you have to have that courage, and you have to be backed up by it, right? That air cover you talked about earlier, Cliff, is key, right? In order to be able to have that courage. I talked a little bit about it earlier in terms of being able to sort of see from a systemic perspective, but also communicate, right? Using the language of your organization, right? Sometimes because we in risk, data and data analytics is a big part of our lives, right? I like to think of it as data is the tool that we use. It is not the language that we speak. It's not our mode of communication. And so there are times for us to be having a data conversation. But if you work for Awesome Bank, speak in Awesome Bank, right? Don't speak in risk, don't speak in data, right? Speak in Awesome Bank, right? Because that's how you will be heard, right? And it will be to your advantage to do so. One of the things we've also talked about, Cliff, is the idea of where does risk generate its power, and the fact that it is not positional power, right? It's not, we don't have the big stick of audit, right? And so the only way risk wins is through influence, right? So it's your ability to be able to generate, develop, articulate clear positions and recommendations, right? But then this is key. Be able to recognize where you end and where they begin. And when you go to the end of your boundary and you've made your recommendation and you know that you've done all that you can do, you have to be okay with letting go of what happens at that point in time. That is key as a second line leader, right? You cannot be so vested, right, that if your recommendation is not taken, right, that you can no longer function within an organization. Or if it's that bad, and in some cases it might get that bad, you may then have to decide that you're no longer, if the nature of the risk is so significant that you may have to determine that you're no longer appropriate for that organization. But assuming that we're not talking that level of gravity, right? Assuming we're talking about, sort of standard risk first line conversations, you got to be able to sort of move to the boundary of your organization and step back and say, our recommendation stands, right? But it's your risks to own. And so if there's a different way that you want to go, then, understand that is not necessarily our recommendation, but we understand it's your risk to own. That's key.
That's interesting. One of the things I think that you find from time to time too, and I think we've also, you and I've spoken about this, is the skills and the expertise that second line needs to have that effective conversation and influence, right? And I oftentimes wonder, I've seen it probably more times like this than not, that sometimes the more effective first line, people that have had business positions in the first line, I have seen become really good CROs. Now, some of that's probably to your point that, as we said before, there's an inherent bias, right, toward that first line. They're the hunter gatherers, and they're bringing things back. And that first line also, to your other point, speaks the language of that business. And so, having managed the P&L, they're in a pretty good position to see that. I won't name the company, but a fairly large bank put in as their first CRO, because they were under an MRA, pretty significant one from the regulator at the time, the person who had head up one of their actually the key business line for them. And talking with their senior folks during that period of time, they said nothing gets by this person because of the stature that they bring to the table, because they all know that this person had this background that knows the business inside and out. So they know the risk. And I'm not saying that's a knock against those of us that come in without that direct business experience into the second line. But sometimes I wonder, what's your thought about that? Do you think that there's a value from having that experience be the person or the people that have that experience coming in to support the ERM function?
I do. And it clearly depends on it. This is really, from my perspective, a dispositional question, because there are people in the first line who should not be anywhere near the second line. Let's be clear, right? The Cowboys of the world don't belong in the second line, right? But there are people who come up in the first line and have a naturally analytical bent to their business, right? And so when you combine that natural analytical bent with the deep knowledge of the business, that person can be extraordinarily effective in the CRO space. I absolutely agree. I think one of the other things we've talked about too, Cliff, is that the idea of rotational opportunities in organizations from first and second line. I love that idea. And I particularly think that organizations that have leader development programs for their high performing leaders, particularly first line leaders, should be required to do some sort of rotational opportunity through a second line space. Absolutely. I think it's a great idea. I think the cross-pollination can only benefit the entire organization.
Yeah, that's a point that I come back to time and time again. I have a mental image of something that a boss of mine once told me and said, Cliff, it's, you can rearrange the boxes on an org chart all you want, and you can, say this person's doing this risk job or this person's doing this business job. But at the end, it's not about the structure so much as it's about the interaction and the people and their mindset. Right. Yes. It's about their mindset. I mean, I'll go back to the fact that the IIA or the Bank for International Settlements is saying, hey, look, we've had variations and updates and all this thing of this 3 lines of defense or model, do you want to call it? But we still have these recurring events where we step into it from time to time. Mm-hmm. Doesn't matter what the bank is, where they are, whatever, it happens. And so the structural issues to me seem somewhat, I don't know how to describe it, confining or limiting. We have this kind of like formalized structure that we adhere to. You're in the first, you're in the second, you're in the third. And yet that feels like, and that already sets us up for an us them kind of thing, sure. Where, oh, you're not in the business. So you gotta be somebody who's gonna be looking over my shoulder, right? We've seen it all. You've been in the first and the second, so have I. And if you're in the first, sometimes you feel that those folks in the second, they're doing just that. They're kind of always knocking on your door. If you're in the second line, you're can be somewhat too deferential. And I'm trying to think of how do you shape that culture? How do you crack that cultural issue in a manner that makes the 3 lines of defense not just some piece of paper or something that you're managing structurally, but you actually are living it. That's a hard thing to do, but how do you do that?
Yeah, I think it goes back to the questioner's original question about the refinements in the 2020 version of the model, right? And the biggest improvements were really about moving away from that strict, I'm in the second line, and you're in the first line. I'll tell you, I'll explain. I'll answer this question by giving a little bit of my personal experience. When I was in a third line role, that was in some ways, that was the most challenging of the roles for me, because where there was a degree of positional power by virtue of having direct reporting to the board of directors, the third line is where the most hard and fast, right? You cannot, sort of step over that line exists, right? Because by definition, if there's a remediation and you've been a part of it, right, you cannot objectively assess, and validate that remediation. So you have to stay on your side of the line. That was difficult for me as a natural problem solver, right? Because I could see it. I would be able to see exactly what the first line should do. And I would want to say, just do that, do that thing right there, right? And I couldn't. The benefit of being on the second line, and this is how I want to lead into the answer to your question, is there doesn't have to be such a hard and fast. And so it allows a second line leader to be consultative in nature the way that a third line leader cannot, right? And that to me is what the benefit of the refinement of the 2020 model, right, sort of gets to, right? It is very much a positioning issue. It's very much of, yes, it is my job to be, quote, all up in your shorts. It is true. It is my job to do that. But again, it's because our objective, or the commonality of our objective, is the pursuit of the organizational objective. The big difference between mine and yours, or at least the way that I have to articulate it, is sustainability. And so if I can approach you, if I can position myself as aligned in our objective, right? And sell the idea, but sustainability is where I'm making my value proposition to you. And I'm attempting to be consultative in nature, as opposed to being someone who is attempting to be bothersome, someone who's attempting to be a tattletale. That isn't my goal. It's funny, when I was on the third line, I was more than happy to have the second line sort of leverage the idea that, hey, first line, would you rather just be spending your time responding to Mia's findings? Or, would you rather partner with us, right, to actually work through some risk management issues so that you don't get the finding? I was more than happy to have my second line folks leverage me that way, right? I think it's one of the tricky things that second line leaders can do. You actually can play both sides if you're organizationally savvy, right? You can do that with the first line and sort of position the third line as, hey, it's us against them a little bit, right? But you can also position yourself with your third line when you know that there's something that you need sort of, moved forward, and you're not the one carrying the big stick, right? Depending on the organizational dynamics, there are times when you can actually leverage the power of the third line as well. But without a doubt, the onus of this and the difficulty, the challenge of this falls on the second line. There are no two ways about it, right? You're the one that has to figure out how to be the most organizationally savvy. No two ways about it.
Yeah, I think that at times, and you're implying it, and I think it definitely comes through, is that there's a trust issue involved with these things, right? Mm-hmm. And that between the first and the second, first thinking is the second and third going to do a gotcha on me because their job. It's kind of like when you go to any kind of audit. It's like, isn't their job to kind of find something? And so at the end of the day, there are these trust issues that have to be sort of resolved, and I think at times it does, you said it, that the second line has a very difficult task for all the reasons we said earlier. And I think it's why you have seen instances in the headlines of fairly large institutions upon, some postmortems of what happened, coming out saying that one of the findings that they had was the first line said, Heisman, I don't
Yes.
need to hear you.
Yes.
And the second line was found to be too deferential.
Yes.
Right? Oh, hands off.
Yes.
Again, I have been accused of playing too much of a bad cop role in my time. And there needs to be balance in those roles, right? You in a moment of despair at a board meeting, I blurted out to the chair of the risk committee. I said, "What do you want? You want a watchdog or do you want a lapdog?" And as I awaited my fate, thinking that was probably the wrong thing to say at that time, but it was in the heat of battle during the 2005-2006 period. Those kinds of things come to the fore, and you have to think about what is it that you really want out of these organizations.
Yes.
You don't want that second line sitting back on their heels, and they need to modulate, right? They need to, and that comes through, as you said before, it comes through stature and credibility that they bring. So this is not a beat up on the first line kind of thing here.
Exactly.
This is that second line owns this as much.
Yes.
They have to your point, they have to demonstrate why that long-term sustainability, and that is not an easy thing to do. So question for you now, Mia, is what can you do? I'm no longer in the business. What can you do to elevate, amplify the skills and ability of your team or anybody's team, right? I think broadly speaking, not your team, but broadly speaking in industry, that lie in the second line to give them the best possible chance of interfacing effectively to the first.
Yeah, it goes back to those traits that I talked about earlier, Cliff, in terms of them being a part of your leader development program, right? So we talked about courage, we talked about communicating in the language of your organization, right? We talked about respecting the fact that your power is the power of influence, right? It is not the power of raw organizational authority, right? And then there's this other concept that I like to talk about. I've made this analogy so much, I think I am going to trademark it. And that's around the fact that risk leaders need to have a really, really healthy ego and need to have that ego in check. And here's why. So I think about risk management in the solar system, and my team, some of whom I know are on right now, have heard me use this analogy, right? So in a solar system, whatever your organization is organized to do, whoever it is organized to serve, whether we call them borrowers, clients, tenants, whomever, right? They are the sun, they are the reason for being, right? They are the reason for the organization to exist, right? That means that the first line, right, the people who are responsible for the objective of the organization is the earth, right? They revolve the sun, they revolve the reason for being. You as the second line, you are the moon. You're the moon. And so think about what that means. You revolve around the first line. The first line does not revolve around you, right? You also revolve around the sun, but only vis-a-vis the earth, right? And so that requires a really, really healthy ego to understand and be good with, right? The idea that your work, which you take tremendous pride in, right, revolves around someone else's work and not the other way around. It requires a very healthy ego to get that. And so as part of leader development, you want to make sure that you have folks that appreciate that role. The moon is extraordinarily important. Oceans don't move without the moon, right? It's extraordinarily important, right? But it is not the center of the Earth's universe, right? And so I think from a leader development perspective, you want to make sure you have leaders who appreciate that. What you don't want in risk, and let me say this, what you don't want in risk are frustrated first line people. Let me be real clear about that. You do not want people in your second line function who are basically people who want to be first line, but for whatever reason that didn't work out for them, right?
Chip on
Because
their
those,
shoulder, right?
right, exactly. Those people have a chip on their shoulder. They're resentful. They're not what you need in terms of the savvy, right, in order to be effective as a risk management leader.
Yeah, and those are different skill sets. No,
Mhm.
totally agree with that. The first line, folks, is as you well know. I mean, that's a sense of urgency. Got to get it done yesterday, kind of an approach.
Yep.
And not everybody is built for that first line role. And as you said, some of those first line people probably don't belong in the second either. So I totally get that. Let me throw this out there in the context of to make this all come alive for an organization. What does that responsibility look like at the top of the house, at the board level, at the CEO level, who I argue is the chief risk officer for the company, despite what others might think, but I do think, right, they own it. They're the ones that are on a day-to-day basis, strategically, tactically, everything. They're making it happen, and risk is, again, part of that equation. So how do we we talk a good story about this, right? We'll talk about, it's the tone from the top and all these kinds of things. But there are these recurring events that happen despite what you see in 10Ks, right? So if you looked at the 2022 SVB 10K or annual report, there's all these wonderful glowing comments about the effectiveness of risk management. We have, executive sessions with our CRO. We have a risk committee of the board, but yet, we had an 8-month period where we had no CRO. How do we make sure that these boards and these CEOs can get it, that are communicating that this model that you just described to both sides, right? To both the first and the second line, but also saying, importantly, that the second line is critical to our success. You got to hear those words come from those people's mouth, or I don't know what 3 lines of defense really does for you.
I agree with you. And we've talked about how I'm going to be very careful with my words here, considering current events. You're completely right that it's more than tone from the top, right? That has to be a mindset of a board and a board risk committee. Now, speaking just factually, without opining, we know that in the postmortem, one of the primary concerns with SVP was the composition of its board risk committee, right? And I think, Cliff, you have published some things recently, and I think, Rob, you've also posted some things recently that speak to this. The board risk committee has to be sufficiently savvy to know what questions to be asking of executive management, right? So we can say we have a board risk committee, and we can say that we have a risk appetite and, charters for various, committees that make up our risk governance. But if we don't have the folks whose responsibility, whose fiduciary role, right, is to ask the hard questions on behalf of the shareholders they represent, then where does that go? And we see that even in regulated situations, being very careful with my words, even in regulated situations, the presence of the regulator does not always mean that that's going to happen. So, it really comes down to, Cliff, the question you're asking is part of the canon of overall corporate governance, right? So anything that you want to ensure that your board is doing, right? How do you effectively make sure that they're doing that, right? So 3LOD falls into that same conversation, right? Around overall corporate governance and raising the bar in terms of our expectations of our organizations.
Couldn't say that any better. I think that sums it up. I'm seeing a question that did come in on something we just were speaking to. So I'm gonna pose this to you. It's
Okay.
Says, how can internal audits support the ERM function without positioning themselves as the policing body of the three? I realize someone has to hold folks accountable, but sometimes the three lines automatically position IA in that way when it can be leveraged in a different way.
It's a great question. And I'm going to suggest that it's both and, right? The second line very much needs IA to lean fully into its independent role, right? And not only inform the board of directors, but in many cases, educate, right? It goes back to the thing we were just saying about making sure that you have a knowledgeable board and board risk committee. In some cases, in many cases, right, we need IA to be a source of education. But I will also completely amen the questioner's comment about the ability to leverage IA more than most organizations do. I am a huge proponent as part of corporate governance to leveraging findings into organizational effectiveness types of efforts, right? I'm a huge proponent of that. And I do think that it is an underutilized asset, right, in many ways. ERM, when most effective, and data technology is a big part of being able to do this effectively. So not every organization can do it, but leveraging findings to fine tune the risk management approach, right, is a sort of no-brainer way, right, to leverage that. And I personally think when risk management is at its most effective, it is serving an OE, meaning organizational effectiveness role, right? I told you, Cliff, you and I talked about before, I have background in finance, but I also have a background in organizational development. And if finance and OD got together and had a baby, it would look a lot like 3LOD, right? So this is a topic that I could talk about all day, but it speaks exactly to what the questioner is saying, right? There are data points that IA generates, and those data points can be leveraged into almost just like with any other, organizational development type of initiative, right? You collect information, that information tells you something about your organization, you develop an intervention as a result of that, whether that's training, whether that's a change culture, whatever it is, right? And then you come back and you measure it. I see internal audit data exactly the same way. It is an opportunity, right, to create some sort of change intervention in how you're doing something from a risk perspective. And then the next audit is an opportunity to assess the effectiveness of that. So I couldn't agree more on the questioner's question, but I do still maintain that I need IA to maintain that policing, if you will, right, that independent voice to educate your board of directors.
I'm wondering to what extent. I mean, I used to tell people, gosh, back in the day, it would have been great to have had the same sort of situation that our head of audit had, right, where they had the direct reporting into the board and all that. And to that point, they carry the big stick.
Yep.
Second line doesn't necessarily really have that, even though technically you have these changes that allow them to have greater, connectivity to the board risk committees these days. But what about smaller institutions? Smaller, three lines sort of is somewhat something that grew out, particularly for the SIFIs, heightened expectations for risk management, all that came about. But what about smaller institutions, community banks, other types of depositories, credit unions? In fact, it just that such a formalized structure might not be as appropriate for them. In fact, it could be that a smaller institution, you may be wearing both hats. I've seen that, right? Yes. Where it, and so to those that say, three lines of defense, should be abandoned, and we need just to manage ourselves more effectively and communicate better, and all these other things that are kind of behavioral, if you will. That I've seen institutions, small institutions that run quite well where somebody's wearing both a kind of a quasi first and second line risk hat. So how do you sort of
You swear
address
that?
that?
Yeah. So I'm going to take a little bit of the sort of regulatory approach here. And the regulators, if you ever read any of the sort of published material, will always say essentially, season to taste, right? Take this guidance and as it is appropriate for your size, scale, and complexity, right? Apply. And so I think that that's probably the right way to think about this. So if you think about a community bank, and let's take credit risk, right, specifically, it is not uncommon, right, for the second and the third lines in a community bank to essentially be the same thing, right? You have a chief credit officer, so you have theoretically a second line function. You don't tend to have a credit review function. And so basically that's an outsourced activity that the chief credit officer sort of oversees and then, presents that outsourced report to the board of directors vis-a-vis the audit committee, right? And that's probably a perfectly fine model, right, for an organization that has a more limited risk profile. Having said that, I've also worked for an organization that fell under the $10 billion sort of, heightened standards threshold that regulators use. But the nature of some of the business lines were necessarily complex enough that the regulators said, yep, you're only 3 billion, but we're going to regulate you like you're 15 because you have some business lines that we think are far more advanced in their complexity than the standard community bank. And so heightened standards it is. And so that's where you get sort of the season to taste, relative to the implementation of these types of frameworks. Because if your small organization, is still complex in ways, at least that your regulators are going to perceive it, it may make sense, right, for you to take the steps to actually delineate independence in your risk management function and in your audit function.
That's a very good point, right? I love that season to taste because it is particular to each institution's circumstances. And again, I'm not asking you to comment, but I'll make a gratuitous comment out there that I think that going in the other direction is what we're going to see in terms of a lot of circumspection about what to do about larger institutions that do not meet the current threshold of 250 billion for enhanced supervision. And I think there's going to be a lot of, right, we're already seeing that discussion happening about what we're going to do about that, or what they're going to do about that. So we'll see where that all lands. Maybe that's a topic for another webinar down the road here.
I would just say, Cliff, to your comment about managing the business better, banking is summed up in one simple word: trust. And that is really bolstered by audit and the regulators in helping in keeping that trust out in the system. And if you're not interested, otherwise go to a hedge fund or a private equity firm that doesn't have as much to get money lent, this, that, and the other. It's just a different type of approach and mindset.
Yep. It at times, and I know this is impractical, but it's almost like institutions, there needs to be sort of an underwriter laboratories for risk management quality, that everybody seeks out to get this independent UL rating on the quality of your risk management. So you can put that on your, say, I'm an A-rated institution,
good
right?
housekeeping for risk management.
Good housekeeping seal, right? And so much, either if it's at the regulatory level, and it's baked down into camels, you don't ever see it because it sits in the regulatory agency. Nobody can see it. One of my questions to you, as I'm looking mindful of the time here, was, what can we do to get for external audiences to get visibility into really what's going on before an event happens? As I said, if you looked at SVB, you looked at the paperwork that they were publishing, everything looked like it was okay, but not so much. And I don't know that there's anything that we can do. Things like FDIC call report information is always kind of, running a little bit behind in terms of lagging, in terms of just the data availability is what it is. But beyond that, that's not going to also tell you about the things we've just been talking about. And I'm not sure you'll ever get to that, but I'd be curious about your thoughts.
Yeah, so you know I have a lot of passion about this topic, so I'm gonna be careful with my words. But let me start out by saying that I could not agree more with what Rob just said about our banking system in trust. It is based on nothing but faith.
Mhm.
It is based on nothing but faith, and we all have a responsibility as it relates to that, right? It's all it's based on. And so to Rob's point, the internal audit, regulatory and risk management functions are critical, right, to undergirding that faith, which undergirds the system. Contrary to some of the conversation that has happened over the last few weeks, right? A regulator's function, right, is not to sound the alarm. It is literally the opposite of what a regulator is supposed to do, right? Sounding the alarm produces exactly what happened, right? So we can certainly argue and have a great discussion about whether, you know, what kind of regulatory approach might have been appropriate here. But certainly we cannot argue with the idea that, oh, they didn't run out and tell everybody this was going on. That's literally the antithesis of what they are supposed to do. What I will speculate, Cliff, is that I bet you going forward, those folks who cover the equity markets for some of our largest banking institutions, our public institutions, will pay a lot more attention to board composition, right? And board risk and audit committee composition. Let me just say that. Let me just say that.
I agree.
I think that's going to get a lot greater scrutiny than it ever has.
Yes.
And those will be conversations that will be elevated to much higher levels within the organization as they start to vet candidates for these positions. I agree.
Yes.
Wow. This has been illuminating, to say the least, Mia. I always enjoy our conversations, and I'm glad we were able to share it with a broader audience today on this topic. I know you and I and Rob have been talking about this for some time, even before all these other recent interesting things have been happening in the news. But with that, I think I'll close this out, if that's okay, and appreciate everybody's time today, taking out of, I'm sure, a busy day for everyone. And we will regroup with another one of these in the second quarter, I think. Rob, we'll come back with more information, and we'll be reaching out to see if you'd like to participate on that one. Thank you.
Thanks,
Thank you,
everybody.
Mia. Thank you, Cliff. Bye.
Take care, guys.